If we start at the beginning and we take it that Comox and Pentlatch ancestors, the ancestors of the present KFN, have been on this territory since the last glaciation. If we read those oral histories about the creation of those two peoples, it doesn't say that they wandered in from somewhere else or that they took over the lands from somebody else or they pushed in. It says that they were created there, that they physically dropped down from the sky at the beginning of time, right? Come into a land where no one else was there. And so if we try to link that, well, we know the geological history of this landscape. We know that between 12 and 14,000 years ago, these glaciers receded for the first time in tens of thousands of years and opened up this new land for people to physically occupy. So right at the end of the last glaciation, the climate changed in the most severe form that we've seen in the last 15,000 years, and maybe rose by 5 or 6 degrees just over the course of a couple generations. And how Comox people would have experienced that, right? They would have moved in to these new territories by boat. They would have come into landscapes that were being colonized by plants and animals for the first time in a very long time. Landscapes that would look very different from now. Landscapes that were flooded as well. Those really ancient archaeological sites that we find on Quadra Island are 180 meters in elevation, right? So that's where the shoreline was back then. When all those glaciers melted, first of all, the sea rose very rapidly. And probably even perceptibly to people in that intergenerational sort of context. Every few years, these settlements would have had to move up or down slope as they're being chased or chasing that seaward edge. And so, the climate was changing then, becoming much warmer by comparison, but still probably fairly cold by our standards, but allowing the ingrowth of new species, the appearance of red cedar, right? Like that's something that we take for granted, but red cedar had to recolonize this land, right? So 8,000 years ago, we have red cedar dominating much of the forest here, but that's a major change that happened in association with climate change over the long term. So if we take that as the grand setting, it's hard to imagine something more extreme than 2 kilometers of ice over our heads to now this beautiful, sunny March day. And we know Comox people were here for all of this time, and especially in that last 2,000 years, we've mapped that archaeology really clear. And from the evidence that we can see even sitting right here, these fish traps, right around 700 years ago, there's a change. All the fish traps are changed in style, right? They go from this heart-shaped trap style to a chevron-shaped trap style. And the researchers who mapped and dated this really clearly think that that's a shift from targeting herring in the traps to targeting salmon in the traps. So what they're suggesting is at that time, 700 years ago, there's a climatic change and it's affecting the marine environment in such a way that herring populations were much more rich than they had been, and then they start to collapse, and salmon populations become much more dense. And from their perspective, Comox, and specifically here, Pentlatch people would have responded by altering the types of traps. They're using exactly the same locations for hundreds of years, but they're changing the style and changing the technology. Perhaps in a way sort of like changing the net gauge of your fish net now, right? You're targeting different species with more or less the same technology. There are 2 major versions of, it's actually the Pentlatch flood story. One version locates it right here at the mouth of the Courtenay River, which is really the Puntledge River, and the other version is located at Comox Lake, which is sort of the outlet of the Puntledge River. And they both describe the events at the beginning of time. Really, the first ancestors dropped down from the sky and arrived there. And if we're thinking back, and this is just to provide some context for the story, if we're thinking back 12,000 years ago, the outlet of Puntledge River would have probably been up around Comox Lake sometime. So it could be that those 2 things are the same, the mouth of the Courtenay River and the mouth of Comox Lake, because back then sea levels were much higher. We have the same thing with the Comox origin story. It doesn't describe people coming down right on the coast. They come down at Quinsam, quite a bit inland, right? So in the Pentlatch origin story, the 2 first ancestors, Comin and Hecaton, arrive from the sky. They arrive from the sky and populate this previous empty lands. Other tribes join them, amalgamate with them, and the people generally prosper. And then something happens. First, the water goes way out, way, way out. It doesn't say how far it goes out, and it doesn't say why the water goes out. But it specifies the water goes really far out, and the women had to go a long way to catch the fish. We think of here, where did the women go to catch the fish? Right there, right? I can see those fish traps from here. So if this is the regular occurrence, we're just going here to get the fish, that's easy. If the water goes way out, we've got to go somewhere else, way, way out to catch the fish. And then Hecaton has a dream. And Coleman and Hecaton, they both have dreams, and they've got to prepare a canoe, fill a canoe full of goods, and create a huge long rope, because they know a flood is coming. They either send a message or they have a dream that the flood is coming. And then sure enough, just like the waters receded way, way out, they start to rise and rise and rise and rise. And there's a point in time when it's flooding the village, and other people are out in their canoes, because every family has a canoe, and they're floating around, and they're asking for help. They come to the canoes of Coleman and Hecaton. I think there's actually 4 canoes. Coleman and Hecaton are the elder brothers. They ask for help from them, but they're not allowed to help them, so they push them away. You know, everybody else drowns. Everybody drowns except for the people in the 4 canoes of Coleman and Hecaton and their family. And their canoes are sort of floundering, floating around above us, I guess, if the waters have risen. And a white whale appears, a white whale called Quinish. And the white whale helps them. It tows them or pushes them, nudges them off into the distance. And as the waters start to recede, it sort of nudges them off into the mountain there. And as the waters recede, the glacier, the white whale, remains stranded on the mountaintop, and the waters recede, and the canoes are landed, and the people can come out of the canoes and repopulate the earth. And so that story describes the origin of the Pentlatch people, the flood event that sort of cleaned the land of the Pentlatch people, and then the origin of the glacier. Like this was pointed out to me by a Comox person as well too, that his reading of this story is that the sea levels are dropping. It's becoming much hotter, right? It's moving into a hotter climate period. And there's perhaps the land is still uplifting at the end of that glaciation. The land is slowly sort of rebounding. It was pushed down so deep because of those heavy glaciers that it starts to uplift. And things get warmer, and the waters are simply farther away than they used to be. But in all probability, those sea levels were much higher, almost certainly much higher at one point in time, and probably all the villages were located wherever those sea levels were at that time, say 4,000 years ago. It's something that we haven't worked in the scientific sequence, but I think that oral history is telling us that these sea levels did change markedly over the experienced, sort of the cumulative cultural experience of the Pentlatch people who were living here. You know, generation to generation, they observed these sea levels change, and some of that change, I think, is linked to major climatic changes as well. One other thing that's, I think, worth commenting on as well, I think they call it the hypsothermal, and I think that's about 8,000 years ago. And things are quite a bit drier and warmer for a spell of time. You know, after the glaciation, you know, thousands of years have gone by, and they moved into this period called the hypsothermal. And at the end of the hypsothermal, that's when you get the red cedar moving in, right? So you move from a dry warm phase to a cooler wet phase, and that's what cedar loves, right? So during the hypsothermal, we had these forests here dominated by oak trees. It's strange, this scrubby Gary oak stuff that now, if you're in sort of western Oregon or in the basin sort of around Portland, you know, not in the west coast of Oregon, but that inland basin, you see these scrubby oak forests everywhere, all the way down to California. And that used to extend all the way here. Well, in some ways it still does extend all the way here. And so into hypsothermal, hemlock and cedar and these other wet-loving conifers start to encroach in, but they don't take over everything. And they certainly would have within probably a few hundred years, if not a few thousand years at the most. But we've got pockets of these Gary oak environments here, you know, right here, up towards Solom, Hornby Island, a pocket around Cowichan, and large pockets on Salt Spring and Victoria, right? And the only explanation, and this is from the biologist and the ecologist, is that human intervention is the only explanation for why these pocket forests still exist, these Gary oak environments still exist. Otherwise they would have been encroached out. And you can see this on Hornby Island. If you go to Helliwell Park, you can see dead standing Gary oaks, very few live ones, and new dominant Doug firs, right? And that's been documented just over the last century. Doug firs are dominating, Gary oaks are dying. And the only reason that's happening is because people have stopped burning the landscape, right? So Gary oaks produce acorns, which are edible, and a lot of other associated plant species that are desirable for your ancestors, camas being one of them. And there's a lot of berry species that thrive in that environment. And so, to the best understanding of archaeologists and ecologists, is that probably beginning 8,000 years ago, the indigenous people here, your ancestors, began burning these environments, burning off the underbrush, and it keeps the conifers from encroaching, right? So they've been doing that for 8,000 years, or else they would be gone. There would be those forests would be recognized in fossil form only. But so 8,000 years until 200 years ago, people purposely burning these environments to maintain those relic populations, right? Because the climate is going through these shifts through time, and if they didn't maintain that, the natural climatic shifts and the succession of species would have wiped out those environments. But those environments were so economically important to your ancestors that year after year, for 8,000 years, they were lighting them on fire. Managing them, right? The Gary oak survives, it drops acorns, produces more stuff. And now that that's stopped happening, the environment's gone. 150 years of stopping burning. Probably, I bet you Hornby wasn't, probably 1860, 1870 is the last time there's probably an Aboriginal fire purposely burnt on Hornby. That's my best bet. And here we are in 2020, and that environment's gone. 150 years, so it stood stable for 8,000 years through human intervention, and now through fire suppression, we've lost it in 5 generations. To me, that's a remarkable story that shows the time depth and understanding of folks here living through this stuff. Right? So how did they adapt to the environmental changes in that situation? They burnt the landscape, prescribed burns, and managed ecosystems for 8 millennia. At least. And it was successful. 200 years ago, people were still trading for this stuff. Princesses were marrying down, marrying the sons of Colman and Hecatan, the chiefs here, to get camas, right? And those are the bride prices that are going back north, boxes and boxes of camas. So they didn't have it here. They didn't have it anywhere north of here. This is the northern extent of it. So, you've got this prized resource patch, this valuable resource patch. And you're trying to maintain the right conditions so you can keep it, or else it's gone. So to me, that's a phenomenal story as well, and I don't know if it's widely appreciated by the public, but it's remarkable. So that's the logic. People who don't understand, that's the logic of protecting these Gary oak ecosystems, right? That's why you get a big fine if you cut one down in town here. These are important relic populations. That are exceedingly rare here, and are all going to disappear very shortly, within the next few generations, unless we maintain them. But I think that's a fantastic story about resiliency in the cultural and technological ways that people figured out how to do things, relatively simple things, to maintain something that was really important. Prescribed burns. We always seem to think of forest fires as bad things, but we might have it a bit wrong. So I think if we study how these Comox and Pentlatch ancestors adapted, what they did, how they responded, what worked for them, what didn't work, then I think we can find ways of allowing Comox people to continue some of these really important practices. Fisheries, shellfish, other resource management, things that are really fundamental to Comox culture, Comox health, Comox well-being. I think if the ancestors, even if they're not here, even if this culture's been kicked around and the colonial powers have done a good job of doing that, I think if we're attentive, I think if we're patient and respectful, we can discern it. We can try to figure it out and reapply some of those things. My understanding is Comox is planning on building fish traps out here in the flats. I know Comox actively manages shellfish and shellfish aquaculture. These practices worked in the past, and they're going to work again in the future. There's no doubt in my mind about that.